All right, so today we're continuing our discussion of ethics. So yesterday we were talking about moral relativism, which is the rejection of moral objectivism. Today we're going to be discussing whether or not we can criticize other societies' morality, which is also related to moral relativism. Because you might think, if moral relativism is true, how can we criticize other societies' morality? So, real quick, let's go over moral objectivism versus relativism, make sure we're all on the same page. Objectivism: for any set of mutually exclusive moral claims, only one moral claim can be correct. So if you and I disagree about some moral claim, only one of us can be right. Relativism rejects that. And there's a variety of ways you could do that. One way to go is to say, look, more than one of those mutually exclusive moral claims can be correct. So you can be correct in thinking that torturing innocent babies is wrong, and I can somehow also be correct that torturing innocent babies is somehow acceptable. Or you could just reject the idea that correct and incorrect are the kinds of things that apply to moral claims. So now let's consider how relativism relates to criticizing other societies. Relativism is just the rejection of objectivism. So then there's this other view, moral isolationism, which was brought up in the reading by Mary Midgley. Moral isolationism is this idea that we're not justified in criticizing any other cultures or other societies' morality. And you might think we kind of quickly get from relativism to moral isolationism. Right? If both of us can be correct even though we disagree, on what grounds can I criticize you? Or if we disagree about something and it doesn't even make sense to ask whether you or I are correct or incorrect in our disagreement, then it would seem difficult to criticize one another's moral claims. But does moral isolationism follow from relativism? Go ahead.
I don't think it follows because moral isolationism is more of like it's saying that it's unjustified to criticize any culture. Rather, relativism. You can still criticize a culture even if it's not, even if it's things that there's not one right answer. You can still like
You're,
criticize a culture. I think.
okay, so what might you criticize another culture for morally, or how might you do that?
For example, some cultures, like in the book, the example was cannibalism. Some
Okay.
cultures practice cannibalism, still practice cannibalism, and others don't. And you can't say that's right or wrong because that's their culture, that's all they know. But you can still kind of criticize that. But it's not, but you don't know if it's right or wrong. Unless it's like your own, like,
I think you're onto something, and I want to push back to get more out of you because like I said, you're onto something. So I'm going to channel my inner Mary Midgley. So look, if you're saying these cannibals aren't correct or incorrect, on the basis of what are you criticizing them?
on basis of your ideas, but they have their own ideas as well.
So are you conceding to Mary Midgley? Okay. You don't have to. I'm just wondering. Okay, I think that was onto something. So I'm interested in the other thoughts that you guys were having, but also I'm interested in following up on this idea that Natalie is sharing. Go ahead.
I feel like that, I mean, it kind of follows from relativism, but moral isolationism kind of deals more with like knowing the other culture or not. So because we don't know their culture, we shouldn't criticize it. But if that is the case, then we don't know everything about our culture and we shouldn't criticize our own. Or like, anyway. But so relativism doesn't really deal with like knowing or not. It just says like it's different for other people. So it's either not true or like true / false or correct or incorrect. Not that's not the case. Or they can both be right versus knowing and not knowing. You know.
Okay. So there's this idea that relativism is more about what we know or don't know.
No, the other one.
Oh, moral isolationism is more about what we don't know or don't know. Okay. Whereas relativism is about this other distinction, namely the distinction between being correct or incorrect. And if those aren't the same distinction, then relativism isn't necessarily going to lead straight to moral isolationism. We would need something else to get there. Yeah, other thoughts?
I
Zach?
think it doesn't follow relativism, just because if you can't criticize another culture, then that basically means you're not allowed to have a belief about any culture. So that's not relativism. That's like neither almost. You can't have any criticism or like you can't support the culture either. I think that's what her argument was. That it basically defeats itself. If you can't criticize another culture, then you also can't support it. And if you can't do either of those things, then how can we think anything is morally right or wrong?
Okay, so it sounds like what you just said at the end there. If we can't criticize or blame other cultures, how can we know whether anything is right or wrong? It sounds like what you just did there was actually go the opposite direction. You started from moral isolationism and then got to moral relativism. So maybe
But isn't relativism different ideas?
well, according
to your own culture, or how an individual perceives morality?
were you describing relativism or isolationism just then?
Relativism.
Okay, so you mentioned culture and society, which is also related to isolationism. So I don't know. What you're saying isn't relativism different, and I'm saying I'm not sure it is based on the description you just provided. So Paula gave us this nice distinction between something about knowing versus something about being correct or incorrect. So you might think that difference between them separates them. But you did notice that, look, if moral isolationism is the right way to go, then it does seem we would have difficulty explaining whether someone who disagrees with us is correct or incorrect, which is another way of saying it would seem that relativism is true. So maybe Zach is onto something too. Maybe moral isolationism doesn't follow from relativism, but maybe relativism follows from moral isolationism. What would Jesse Prinz say about which one follows from the other, if at all? So think back to the reading that Jesse Prinz gave us. He discusses what relativism entails for moral debate, moral disagreement, whether or not we can criticize certain people like Hitler. Does Prinz think that moral isolationism follows from relativism? Why or why not?
Is this from today's reading or yesterday's?
So Prinz was yesterday's reading. So first question, does Prinz think that we can criticize people as moral relativists? Yes. what types of behaviors would we criticize if we're moral relativists, according to Jesse Prinz? So Jesse Prinz mentions Hitler. Does Jesse Prinz think we can criticize Hitler? Yes. Why? This is starting to seem like a really good test question. Go ahead.
Didn't you talk about how like when the behavior is like unsustainable because like people are dying?
Good. So certain behaviors or practices, traditions, whatever, are self-destructive. Right? So if there's a behavior or a practice or a tradition in your culture that is self-destructive, like it kills lots of people, that seems like we have, that would be upsetting and something we would want to criticize, especially if it's destructive towards us, right? So if some other culture exists that has these practices and traditions that is destructive towards me or my people or my culture or my society, I've got plenty of reason to criticize these people, even if we disagree about morality. So according to Jesse Prinz, we can criticize other cultures and society's morality when they're self-destructive, or when maybe they're just destructive. Notice the criticism wouldn't be, I think you're incorrect in your behavior or your practice or your tradition. It'd be, I think your behavior, your practice, your tradition is bad. Why is it bad? Because it's self-destructive, or just destructive in general, and those things are bad. Yeah.
But like saying that it's bad when they think it's good, isn't that just disagreeing with them and telling them that what they think is wrong?
If the criticism was,
Like with the Hitler case,
It-
they thought that it was good to get rid of, Jews, and then if we go to say like that's self-destructive, that's bad, things that it's good, we're saying like it is the opposite of what you think, so what you think is false, wrong.
so at no point does Jesse Prinz invoke truth or correctness in that criticism. So one, you might think it's implied. You might think it is correct that what you're doing is self-destructive. And there's two possible things to say about that. One is, Jesse Prinz isn't saying it's morally correct that that is self-destructive. He's saying, no, it's a fact, not a moral fact. Just like, it's the type of thing we can just observe. The thing that this culture or society is doing is destructive. Like, all I've done is describe the way things are. I haven't described the way things ought to be. Okay? So things can be correct and incorrect in just pure terms of observation. And if that's what Jesse Prinz means, then he hasn't, contradicted himself. We can call out other cultures and societies for, in fact, being destructive. But if Jesse Prinz also says, oh, and by the way, destruction is morally bad, and I'm correct about that, then Jesse Prinz has made a moral claim, and in a way that belies some sort of objectivism. So if you're just describing the way things are, that's not necessarily a claim about what is morally correct. If you're describing the way things ought to be, you might be making a claim about what is morally correct. Okay, so all of this is just to say that this natural, intuition that we might have, that relativism and moral isolationism kind of go together. Either one follows from the other, or the other follows from the first one. That natural intuition we might have might not stand up to scrutiny. And Jesse Prinz gives us, kind of explicit reasons why you could be a moral relativist and not be a moral isolationist. Meaning you could be a relativist and still criticize other cultures and societies on the basis of how self-destructive or just destructive they are. Okay. So now we're going to consider the thought experiment from Mary Midgley's paper. Samurai culture believes that they can try out new swords on chance wayfarers. A samurai sword has to be tried out because if it was to work properly, it had to slice through someone in a single blow, from the shoulder to the opposite flank. Otherwise, the warrior would bundle his stroke. This could injure his honor, offend his ancestors, and even let down his emperor, so tests were needed, and wayfarers had to be expended. Any wayfarer would do, provided, of course, it was not another samurai. So, is anyone okay with this practice? Does anyone feel like they cannot criticize this practice? Like, cannot rationally criticize this practice? Because you might think, look, if you're in a room alone with a samurai, you might think, I'm probably not going to criticize this samurai, because maybe they could hurt you. But that's not rational persuasion. That's just threats. So rationally, can you criticize this? I'm getting some nods. Yes. Why? Go ahead.
You can criticize them based upon our Western culture, moral values and ideals. But those are our ideals that we were raised with. And if we apply our idea of what's moral to that scenario, then we might criticize them. But if you are in a culture where they value other things over individual human life, then they would, yeah.
Okay, so you're saying we would employ some standard when we do this criticism.
Yeah, if we criticize them, we would be inputting our ideals onto them.
Mm-hmm.
So we could only understand it from our Western culture lens, and we could only criticize it through that lens.
Could we not understand it from the samurai lens?
I think.
Continue, and then we'll come over to
Okay.
Natalie.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think that understanding is more a spectrum than a black and white. It's I don't know if it's you either understand or you don't. I think that you can improve your understanding through conversation and yeah. So I think that you can come to a bit of a better understanding, but I don't know if it's a 100% yes or no thing. If that makes sense.
Right, so Mary Midgley has this idea about how understanding is supposed to be important for whether or not we should criticize another culture. Something like, we should understand a culture before we're justified in criticizing it. But Mary Midgley also says, look, understanding's not just this black and white binary notion, as Shana was mentioning. It comes in degrees. So the more we understand a culture, the more we are able to praise or criticize them. Okay. So suppose you understand samurai culture. Could you criticize this practice from the standpoint of samurai, as opposed to from whatever our standpoint is, in the West? Go ahead.
I think you can understand it because it's saying that if he doesn't practice this the slicing of the sword or whatever, then it could injure his honor, offend his ancestors, and that's his culture. You can understand in the sense of how embarrassing in a sense. The people in your family or the people who have lived in your family kind of is wrong. So in the sense of the samurai, I don't think the practice is bad because that's their culture. Maybe in the westernized society, it's bad because he's killing someone, but that's his culture and that's what they've grown up to know. So I think you can kind of understand his or their point of view.
Okay, so you're trying to say we as Westerners could, on some level, understand the samurai point of view, and it sounds like that would imply we could understand why what they're saying is acceptable.
Yeah.
Okay. So now imagine that we understand the samurai point of view. Could we somehow get to the conclusion that this samurai practice is bad? Go ahead.
If we were to use like what they said in the last chapter, how the destructive it is, destructive to their own people, you could argue that that's a reason for criticizing this specific practice. But I don't think that understanding itself would be enough to criticize, unless, like she said, it's 100%, but it's not.
Okay, so there's 2 points there. One, this sounds like destructive behavior. Jesse Prinz has given reasons to think we can criticize destructive behavior even if we're not objectivists about morality. So even if we grant the idea that samurai culture has a different morality than whatever our culture has, we still have the resources to criticize samurai culture, at least for this practice. Okay, and then there's the second idea that how much understanding their culture is going to help us in criticizing their culture. And the thought was something like it would have to be full understanding in order to properly criticize the culture. Full understanding probably isn't possible. Therefore, maybe we can't, either we can't criticize the other culture or we can't criticize another culture on the basis of understanding. Go ahead.
I feel like I should clarify that, like, that's the view if you believe that relativism is true, that, or in the case that, like, there are multiple truths, I guess, then you could say that full understanding is necessary to criticize, but on the other hand, like, we're justified in criticizing if we do believe that there is one truth. So, just wanted to clarify that. Like, that's only the case if...
Okay. I see. So, the moral objectivist has a way to criticize this as well. Go ahead.
How are we defining total understanding? Like, how do you know that you completely understand a different culture without, like, your prior values possibly, like, clouding that? Like, how do you know that you actually understand things through their point of view? You know?
So, yeah, so Mary Midgley thinks that understanding is important for criticizing other cultures. And so, if she thinks that we can criticize other cultures, then surely she knows what it would be to understand another culture, because she thinks understanding is required for criticism and we can do the criticizing. So what does Mary Midgley say understanding is? Like, how do we know if we've properly understood another culture, according to Mary Midgley? I honestly don't know the answer to this question. I'm asking if any of you found the answer to the question. Go ahead.
I mean, I know it said she like made the example with like an Indian tribesman who like got an operation in Brazil or somewhere in South America, and then immediately started to criticize the culture. And she basically said that you can't criticize a culture right away. You have to be there for at least more than 2 weeks. But I don't know if that's like, being there for 2 weeks is not a good. I don't think she actually specified how long you have to be somewhere.
Okay. That's at least one condition. If you're there for less than 2 weeks, you don't understand the culture. So then we might say, but when can we feel confident that we have understood the culture? So that's something we might want to ask of Mary. Go ahead.
I feel like in her perspective, she's kind of saying that in in this case, like, is he justified in criticizing them because he's only been there for 2 weeks? But she doesn't even think that we understand our own culture fully. So I feel like she's saying that, like, there is no way to, if we're basing criticism on understanding, you know, we can't even know our own culture 100%, so there's no way that we can understand another one 100%, thus we can't criticize them if that's the criteria.
Okay. That's interesting. Is the idea there that Mary Midgley doesn't actually think that understanding is important for criticizing?
I know, but like I'm getting both vibes here.
Okay. Yeah, I was getting the other vibe.
Maybe she's
But-
saying that you can't understand, so you can't, I don't know.
Right, yeah, I think that's the point that was at least implied by what Paula was saying. It's possible that the conclusion, like, it's possible that what Mary Midgley is using to argue against moral isolationism is also a reductio of this idea that understanding is important for criticizing. So, you know, reductio ad absurdum is, you guys might remember how this works. You assume the opposite of what you're trying to prove, and then you show how something absurd follows from that assumption, which allows you to conclude that that assumption is false. So maybe what Mary Midgley is trying to do all along is just say, assume understanding is important for criticizing other societies and cultures. And then she says some things that make you think what she's trying to do is show you that you can criticize other societies and cultures. But then she says this thing where she's like, look, we can't even fully understand our own society and culture. And if that was the case, we couldn't criticize or blame our own culture. But surely we can do that. So maybe the implied conclusion is supposed to be, so understanding isn't that important for criticizing other cultures or societies. I'm open to that interpretation, I guess. I was not getting that when I was reading it. Was there another hand? Go ahead.
That was just what I was trying to pinpoint in the beginning of class when I was saying you didn't understand. That's what I was trying to say.
Okay.
That's the vibe I got. I didn't get the vibe you were getting.
Interesting. Okay, so we're going to have to do some textual analysis in our in-class assignment and get to the bottom of this. So we've already discussed how the relativist can criticize this practice, namely, the samurai practice is destructive. That's not a moral claim, that's just a factual claim. Destructive practices are very upsetting. So we would criticize it, even if we're a moral relativist, or at least we could criticize it. Go ahead.
I'm kind of having like a hard time trying to differentiate destructive, like the word destructive, from moral versus factual, because like some people may view what we see as destructive as a sacrifice, and then that might be like morally good on their side. So, like, when do you know that it's factually destructive? When they might think that our destructive is more sacrificial.
Yeah, so it seems like there could be a few ways of construing what we mean by destructive, right? So destructive could just mean whenever killing is involved. But then you might think, well, that's going to rule out a lot, right? In these kind of hopefully rare situations, you have to kill in order to accomplish something else that's more important, right? So a common example people think of is in war, right? You sometimes have to engage in battles that kill innocents. So some innocent people die. But the thought is, look, these battles prevent even more innocent people from dying. So yes, it's destructive in a sense, but it's preventing greater destruction. So maybe what we would say is, look, something is destructive when it is more destructive than it has to be. So if we engaged in battles and killed more innocents than would have been killed if we just never had the battle, that battle would be destructive. But if the battle saved more innocents than it ended up killing, then it's actually not a net destructive battle. In the end, it's not actually destructive. It's constructive. And there are probably other ways to define destructive, right? But that's one way that will allow us to differentiate destructive from non-destructive in the ways that are going to capture our intuitions about these cases, like about war. Okay. So we've, oh. So here's an argument against moral isolationism from Mary Midgley. This will be in the in-class assignment as well, so you don't have to write this down now. So if we believe that social outsiders can deliver perfectly good indictments of our society, then the indictments must apply to our society as much as anyone else's. And we believe that social outsiders can, in principle, deliver perfectly good indictments of our society. So what follows from this? Go ahead.
I kind of got like two conclusions from it. Like at first when I read it, I thought that she meant like then we can also deliver perfectly good indictments of other people's society. But now I feel like she's saying that whatever the outsiders say about our society has to apply to all other societies. So
Right.
I don't know which one of those it is.
So the consequent of that first line, the thing that comes after the word then, is supposed to be our conclusion here. The indictments of this social outsider must apply to our society as much as anyone else's. That's starting to sound a bit like moral objectivism. So that's roughly the conclusion. So interestingly enough, arguing against moral isolationism is very close to arguing for moral objectivism. Arguing for moral objectivism would be arguing against moral relativism. Right, so some of the arguments in this paper could be useful to you in writing paper 2. Here's another argument. If we could not criticize other culture societies, then we could not praise them either. But we do praise other cultures and societies. So what follows from this? Go ahead.
We can't criticize other cultures.
Good. So again, this will be in your in-class assignment. So now, real quick, I just want to apply some stuff from way back in like week 1 or 2. When we're considering whether something is an argument, a piece of evidence, or just an intuition. So here's a claim from Mary Midgley. Moral isolationism would entail moral skepticism. But none of us is going to accept a skeptical diagnosis. We cannot do so because our involvement in moral isolationism does not flow from apathy, but from a rather acute concern about human hypocrisy and other forms of wickedness. But we polarize that concern around a few selected moral truths. We are rightly angry with those who despise, oppress, or steamroll other cultures. Is this an argument? Is it evidence? Is it both? Is it just an intuition? What's going on here? So suppose you don't find an argument in there, and you don't find evidence in there. What have you found? Right. So is anyone finding an argument in there or evidence in there? It is. So you might think, if this is an argument, it probably is a reductio. And it goes something like this. Assume moral isolationism. And then you get to a conclusion. The conclusion is moral skepticism. Moral skepticism is supposed to be absurd. Therefore, moral isolationism is absurd or false. That's the best case scenario for the argument. But now we'd need to ask, okay, so how did we get from moral isolationism to moral skepticism? And unless that is a logically valid process, then the reductio fails. And then you might also ask separately, like suppose whether or not this is a reductio. When someone says what we do believe, or how we do think, none of us will accept a skeptical diagnosis. Suppose somebody tells us, look, you don't believe moral skepticism. Does it follow that moral skepticism is false? Interesting. And when somebody says that we do things because of certain truths, they just call certain things truths. Look, the reason men and women behave the way they do is because there's these truths about gender. Have they given you a reason to think that whatever these claims are about gender are actually true? Right, they've just called them true. Okay, so best case scenario, this is a reductio, and then it is an argument. If we find out that that reductio doesn't actually work, then it's not an argument, and it doesn't seem to be evidence, so it would be an appeal to intuition. So now we're going to start our in-class